The shadow in Ray's living room took on shape and substance, and he nearly squeezed the trigger before he realized who stood there, Sheriff Brody, face drawn and worried. "Ray?" Brody asked softly. "Your door was unlocked, your car in the driveway, just wanted to be sure you were all right." Ray forced a smile, each muscle in his face protesting the lie. "Late night at the station, that's all," he said with a shrug. His voice sounded hollow even to himself. Luckily, Brody didn't pry, he nodded and retreated, leaving Ray alone with the phantom chill of Caligula's whispered threats. Miller's death, so brutal and bizarre, weighed like lead in the back of his mind. Months slipped by. To everyone's surprise, the murder ceased, as if the killer had grown bored or migrated elsewhere. But Wellington's reprieve brought no peace. Instead, a new, unsettling phenomenon reared its head. Giant raccoons, bigger than any Ray had ever imagined, began shambling into town under cover of darkness. They weren't overtly aggressive. They pillaged trash cans, left muddy prints on back porches. But wherever they went, they dropped ancient Greek coins, those same coins that had marked each gruesome murder. The coins formed patterns, strange lines and curves that defied simple explanation. The police were too rattled by recent events to do more than chase off the creatures, and soon gave up. Ray's nightmares subsided slightly, but never left him. In therapy, he tried to piece together what had happened with Miller, with Caligula. The shrink gave him standard platitudes, but Ray couldn't shake the feeling that this was all connected: Caligula, the coins, and now these impossible raccoons. He started noticing a pattern in how the coins were arranged. They weren't random at all. Late at night, under the pale moon, they seemed to glimmer in unison, as if breathing with a silent rhythm. The shapes they formed weren't letters, not as humans know them, but symbols, ancient glyphs that hummed with hidden power. Ray felt their pull, like a compass drawn toward the true north of madness. One moonless night, Ray followed a fresh trail of coins into the deepest part of the woods. His breath caught in his throat as he realized they were guiding him, beckoning him forward. The path led him to a cave, its mouth yawning blackly beneath twisted pines. The scent inside was thick, like old pennies and rotten meat. The air itself felt diseased. Ray crept in, flashlight trembling in his hand. Within, he found the giant raccoons, clustered in unsettling silence. Their eyes glowed faintly, reflecting his beam like dozens of tiny, staring moons. In front of them, a colossal symbol had been painstakingly assembled from thousands of ancient coins, an enormous circle that nearly covered the entire cave floor. The raccoons moved about with an eerie purpose, placing coins just so, nudging them into perfect alignment. It was no animalistic scavenging. It was a ritual. At the heart of that dreadful circle, something stirred. Ray barely caught a glimpse before he felt a wrongness in his mind, as though the universe had hiccuped. A shape, indefinable, draped in darkness, shifted and rumbled. A single, monstrous eye opened, reflecting Ray's trembling form back at him. In that eye, he glimpsed horrors older than time. Not just violence, this was a hunger that spanned epochs, a presence that recognized no boundaries of flesh or reason. His stomach lurched. His gun, his training, his logic, none mattered now. The creatures and the coin-choked circle were just heralds, assembling a gateway, a conduit for whatever lurked in that darkness. With dawning horror, Ray understood, Caligula was no mere killer, but a herald of something vast and unspeakable. The raccoons, puppets drawn by the gravitational pull of an ancient will. The murders had been the start of a ritual. Now came the transformation of Wellington into a stage for this malignant force. Ray's flashlight flickered. The eye blinked, slow and terrible. He couldn't stay. He'd go mad if he did. Slowly, painfully, he backed out of the cave, each step a battle not to scream. When at last he emerged into the cool night air, he realized he was sobbing silently. The distant wind whispered through the pines, and he could almost imagine it forming words. He sensed that whatever he'd seen inside that cave was aware of him now, marking him like a candle in a black void. He staggered away, heart a frantic drum, mind spiraling. Waylington's ordeal was no random crime spree, no disturbed murderer. This was a cosmic infection spreading through the land, with Caligula as its agent. The nightmare had deepened, and Ray Maxwell was caught in its swirling center. As he reached the edge of the woods, Ray dared to glance over his shoulder. A dull glow from the cave's direction lit the night sky faintly, like distant hellfire. That eye, that impossible eye, still fixed in his memory, promised that this was far from over. Human fear was just the appetizer, something far greater would feast soon. Clutching his gun, knowing it was useless, Ray trudged back toward town. The coins still pulsed faintly in his mind's eye, their patterns etched into his soul. He'd come seeking answers, but he left with only one certainty: the horror at Waylington's doorstep was older than any god he knew, and its hunger would not be denied. Ray called in sick the following morning. After what he'd seen, he needed time to steady his trembling hands, time to lock away the screams that clawed at his throat. He paced his living room in silence, blinds drawn, trying to craft a story that he could half believe himself. How could he explain the impossible to anyone else? A few hours passed in tense quiet before Sheriff Brody knocked on his door. Brody entered like a gust of unwanted wind, bearing a six-pack and a casserole, his concern painted plainly on his weathered face. "Ray, buddy," Brody said, pouring 2 drinks without asking, "you look like you wrestled a bear." Ray forced a laugh, too sharp, too hollow. "Just a rough week, Sheriff." Brody's eyes narrowed slightly. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken truths. "You're hiding something, aren't you?" he asked softly. Ray's heart fluttered. He was too raw, too shaken to weave convincing lies. But he had no choice. How could he tell Brody about creatures that emerged from darkness, about coins that pulsed with ancient wickedness? "No, Sheriff," Ray managed, voice low and strained. "Just stress." For a moment, Brody studied him, and Ray feared the sheriff would press further. But Brody only sighed, setting down his drink. "Take it easy, all right," he said quietly. "We can't risk another Miller incident. You're more valuable to this town than you realize." With that, Brody left, and Ray stood alone in his dim living room, clutching his arms as if to hold himself together. He should have felt relieved that Brody didn't pry deeper, but instead, he felt hollow, guilty for not warning him of the creeping horror that had already claimed Miller's life. That night, Ray's sleep turned foul. The nightmare came for him again, more vicious this time. He jolted awake to faint scratching at his window. Outside, in the gloom, stood Caligula, his face twisted into a mocking grin. "So, you followed the trail," Caligula hissed through the glass. His voice grated like metal on bone, setting Ray's teeth on edge. "You found the cave. What did you see?" Ray's tongue was sandpaper. He tried to speak, to plead, to demand answers, but nothing emerged except a choking silence. Caligula's laughter spilled into the room, thick and poisonous. "You've only just begun to understand," he whispered. "There is an ancient evil here, older than gods, older than time. You, Ray Maxwell, are bound to it now." He reached through the windowpane, impossibly, as if it were mist, and seized Ray's shirt front. From his coat pocket he drew a drachma coin glowing an infernal red. Before Ray could resist, Caligula pressed the molten coin against Ray's chest. It burned through cloth and skin, carving a searing brand into his flesh. Ray screamed. It was a scream that tore free from his lungs and strangled the air, a sound that hammered at the walls. His vision blurred, tears and sweat mingling. The pain was so intense he could scarcely think. By the time he blinked through the agony, Caligula was gone, vanished as abruptly as he'd appeared. The only proof he left behind was the smell of scorched fabric and the raw, swollen brand on Ray's chest. As Ray staggered to the window, desperate for fresh air, he spotted it, a single giant raccoon lurking just beyond the glass. It stared at him, eyes reflecting distant starlight, silent and inscrutable. No mere animal, this creature felt like a sentinel, posted by ancient powers to watch him twist in confusion and pain. Ray cradled his wounded chest, feeling the brand's feverish throb under his fingertips. He understood now that he'd become a piece on someone else's chessboard, a pawn caught between forces older and crueler than any human killer. The raccoon tilted its head slightly, its presence a quiet warning. Beyond the cave, beyond the coin circles and whispered incantations, something stirred, an ancient entity waking from a long slumber. Wellington's horrors were only the beginning, and Ray Maxwell would be forced to walk a path of nightmares far darker and steeper than he'd ever imagined. Crouched in the darkness of his living room, Ray realized he could not run, he could not hide. He was marked, trapped in a cosmic game with no rules, no mercy. And outside his window, the monstrous raccoon merely watched, patient and still, as if waiting for the final curtain to fall.